So for those of you that don't know me, I am Luke Tate. I work with Jia Zhang. I'm a postdoc in his lab. A little bit of info just whilst we wait for the last few people to join. You can find all of the slides and the files for the MATLAB practical session at this link here. I did send this out in the email, but about half an hour ago I noticed a typo in the slides. So if you downloaded before then, you might want to re-download the slides. Again, once the session's finished, I will upload the recording of the session to this link as well. Secondly, if you've got any questions throughout the whole session, either feel free to unmute your microphone and ask me. Just interrupt at any time, don't worry about that. Or you can ask sort of larger questions on this workshop. So the other sort of tutors, the people that have been helping me organize this, Mourinho, Alex and Dominic, they're keeping their eyes on the workshop now. On the forum now at this link. So if you have any questions, by all means ask, and one of these guys will hopefully respond to you ASAP. Just in terms of the forum, there's a few things that I've been informed that I should mention to you guys. Firstly, if you don't have to register in order to view the questions or ask any questions, you can just post as a guest and view as a guest. If you do decide to register, it will, so first of all, you will get a confirmation email, but this will, if you're on your Cardiff account, apparently it will go to your junk email. So just bear that in mind. And secondly, it will ask you to give your gender and your birthday. I didn't set that, that was just a setting on the forum. So by all means lie about that if you would rather not give that information out. Cool. So I will just crack on now and get started. I'll assume that everyone that's joining is joining. So the aims of this tutorial, essentially I wanted to organize a tutorial that introduces non-mathematicians, so neuroscientists, psychologists, biologists and so on, to some of the concepts and the mathematical background behind the models that we use to model brain dynamics. So I hope that by the end of this tutorial, you'll be able to differentiate between different types and different levels of brain model, that you will understand some basic terminology in the field of dynamical systems theory, and that you'll be able to implement and solve a model of brain dynamics. So in particular, that will be the practical session, and you'll be using a model of cortical oscillations that you'll be doing during the practical session. A little bit of sort of a broader background. This tutorial was actually supposed to be the first session of a one-day event where we had 3 practical tutorials from researchers in Kubrick, and then additionally 2 keynote seminars where you could see the stuff that you'd learned at these tutorials in action with modern state-of-the-art research. Unfortunately, because of the COVID-19 outbreak, we had to postpone this event. So the current plan is to run the remaining tutorial sessions in a one-day event when the university opens, and also the seminars. But depending on the length of the closure and how successful we feel this workshop went, we might change our mind and deliver the other sessions virtually as well. And if that's the case, we will let you know as soon as possible. But therefore, feedback would be really appreciated. If you think the virtual delivery was successful or not very successful, please let us know. So you can do that either via email, or you can post again on the forum that was shown before. So I'm going to start off giving you an introduction to brain models, a bit more of a general introduction to the different types and what we mean when we talk about modeling the brain. So this article here, this review article from Nature Neuroscience, they separated the types of computational model used in cognitive computational neuroscience into 3 categories. So firstly, they had cognitive models. Can everyone see my laser pointer here? Someone just, yes, thank you, great. So first of all, they showed cognitive models. And these are models which aim to directly explain behavioral data. So if you have a plot of biological fidelity, biological realism, versus cognitive fidelity, cognitive realism, these cognitive models fall somewhere around here. they can explain the behavioral data, and they have high cognitive fidelity, but reasonably low biological fidelity. They don't explain what is biologically happening within the brain. On the other end of the scale are computational neuroscience models. So these have higher biological fidelity, they fall over here, but not necessarily. They might have high cognitive fidelity, but they also might not. And these intend to explain neural activity patterns, so the actual dynamics of the neurons in the brain. And finally, falling somewhere in the middle of these, somewhere partway between them, is the artificial intelligence type model. So these tend to be models of neural networks, artificial neural networks, where the weights are trained such that the neural network can perform a complex task. And you can see they marked these different models with various levels of complexity. And up here in the top right corner, with very high biological fidelity and high cognitive fidelity, but also really high complexity, is the human brain, or an accurate model of the human brain. And that's something right now, we don't have models that can capture all of this. So just to give you an idea of these different types, these different levels of model in action, I'll talk to you about a task that many of you in Kubrick, at least, might have come across before. And this is a perceptual decision-making task. So the participant is sat down in front of a screen, and the screen shows a group of dots moving. Now, a certain percentage of the dots will be moving coherently, either left or right. And the participant has to make the decision, were the dots moving left or are they moving right? So essentially, if we have 100% coherence, all the dots will coherently be moving in one direction. If you've got 50% coherence, all of the dots are moving, half of the dots are moving one way and half of them are moving randomly. And finally, if you've got 0%, they're all moving randomly. The type of behavioral data you might choose to model here are things such as percentage of trials which are correct. So if I have 100% coherence, lots of the trials are correct. We usually get it right every single time. Whereas if we've only got 1% coherence, it's nearly a 50-50 chance. On the other hand, we might also choose to model reaction time. So how quickly you make the decision. And you can see that usually people find it easier, they respond quicker with more coherence. So now I'm going to talk about 3 different approaches that have been taken to modeling this particular task. So over up here in the top left corner, we have a model known as the drift diffusion model. So essentially here we have 2 boundaries. We have 0 and A. One is called the right boundary and one is the leftward boundary. And then we start somewhere in the middle of 0 and A. Halfway if there's no bias, but if there is more bias, we might start closer to one or the other. But let's say we start halfway in between them. Essentially then, what the model does is it has a random walk, so it randomly diffuses in one direction or the other. Well, it's random, but then the diffusion is, there is a drift coefficient, so it's being pulled towards one of the 2 boundaries. And the strength at which it's being pulled is related to the coherence and the direction of the dots. So if we've got very strong coherence, 100% coherence going towards the leftward, for example, we would see a very strong pull towards A. If it was a strong coherence towards the rightward, it'd be a strong pull this way. And if there's no coherence at all, it would just randomly float around. There'd be no pull, no drift. So this is an example of a cognitive model. It can very accurately capture the reaction times and the percentage of correct trials in this model, but it doesn't describe what the neurons in the brain are doing to make this decision. So on the other end of the spectrum, we have a model that looks something like this. So this is a computational neuroscience type model, where the authors modeled something like 7,200, I think that is the number of neurons. So 7,200 neurons in a part of the brain, and they have 2 separate, well, they have several pools of neurons, but they have 2 pools of neurons that are responsible for making the decisions. So one is a pool of neurons that fire when they decide to go left, and one is a pool of neurons that fire when it decides to go right. And these neurons are realistically synaptically connected, and they have realistic dynamics. So the coherence is put in now as an input to two pools of neurons. So if we have strong coherence towards the left, strong coherence and leftward moving, for example, this would be very strong. The input to the left population would be very strong, and the input to the right population would be very weak, and vice versa if we had strong coherence the other way. And then you can look at the simulated spiking activity of the neurons up here, and you can see what you tend to see is one population will eventually start firing very high, very strong firing rate, whilst the other population's firing rate is dampened out. And that means that the brain has made a decision. It's decided that the red population here is which direction they're moving. So this is an example of a computational neuroscience type model. Finally, down here in the bottom left, and now I will admit that this is the one that I know least about, so please don't ask too many questions here. We have the recurrent neural network type model, the artificial intelligence model. So these authors, Song et al., they essentially took a recurrent neural network, so lots of artificial neurons, and what they do is they train the weights on the network, train the weights of connectivity between the neurons, and they give some input related to the coherence and the direction of movement, such that, and then they train the weights such that we can accurately recreate the curves, the percentage correct and the reaction time curves. So this is an artificial intelligence type model. It's generally seen as less biologically realistic as this type of model, because we don't know that the way these weights are trained, we don't know if that recreates realistic activity. Here we've set up what we believe to be, or the authors have set up what they believe to be a realistic network structure that really recreates what is happening in the brain. Whereas here, they've just trained weights and we hope that it reflects what's happening in the brain, but we don't really know for sure. So that's the main difference between these different types of models. Throughout both this tutorial and also the larger workshop as a whole, we are going to focus on the computational neuroscience type models. And in particular, we're going to focus on a slightly larger scale than this. We're going to focus on macro scale neural mass type models. So what these do, instead of simulating thousands and thousands of neurons and then calculating the firing rate from them or calculating the neural oscillations or so on, what we do is we directly simulate for each population of neurons, for each set of neurons, we directly simulate the firing rate of them. So in this paper by Wang and Wang, they took this this model of spiking neurons, and they actually reduced it down to actually only requiring two equations, which directly modeled the firing rate as populations 1 and 2. And you can see here, going from 7,000 equations to 2 equations, there's a reasonably accurate model of the dynamics, model of the cognition, whilst greatly reducing the complexity of the model. So one of the reasons I wanted to highlight this particular task is because Kong-Fat Wang Lin, the first author on this paper, is actually going to be one of the keynote speakers when we finally get around to having the keynotes run. So you'll have a little bit of background, you'll learn a bit more about this during his talk. But secondly, I think this is a really nice demonstration of macro scale modeling approach that we're going to be taking throughout. And the reason that we've chosen to model this macro scale type dynamics is because most people in Kubrick, at least, will be predominantly interested in macro scale dynamics. So I believe that most of the people in Kubrick will be working on MEG, EEG, fMRI, so on like that, where you can't actually see the spiking activity of individual neurons, but you can measure things like functional connectivity, large-scale oscillations, large-scale dynamics of the brain. And also many people are interested in multimodal approaches. So by having these approaches to very simply, low-dimensional models of large-scale brain activity, we can do things such as wire it up with structural connectivity and then simulate these models at different regions of the brain, and then calculate things such as functional connectivity between regions. So this is just one example of what we can do, but it shows how we can integrate these models with neuroimaging data to try and understand the mechanisms underpinning cognition. Sorry, I've got a bit of a cough, so I'm just going to take a quick sip. So now I'm going to talk to you, and this is going to be the main focus really of this talk, about dynamical systems. So dynamical systems is the mathematical background behind implementing these computational models of brain dynamics. So here are two books that I think are quite nice and quite interesting for people who don't have necessarily a really strong mathematical background. So I should say now that what I'm going to talk to you about now, I'm not going to be giving lots of formal or lots of serious mathematical definitions. I'm going to give more of a conceptual approach. So the definitions and so on are going to be slightly informal. And these are more along the lines that might be given by these two books, which are really nice introductions to dynamical systems. So the Strogatz book in particular will need a little bit of maths background, but not lots of maths background. It's not very formal, and it's got lots of applications to physics, biology, chemistry, and engineering. Whereas the Ezikovic book is really nice for studying these dynamical systems in neuroscience, and it gives really non-mathematical introduction to this. So first of all, what are dynamical systems? So a dynamical system is a mathematical description of something that evolves over time. So this could be the dynamics of the brain. It could be the firing rate of a population of neurons. Or, for simplicity's sake, it could be a car moving along a track. So if we have a car and we say its position along a straight track is X, then typically how we would describe the dynamics of the car is we would talk about its speed. We'd say the car's moving at 60 miles an hour. So what is speed? What does speed mean? So let's plot now, for a car moving at constant speed, let's plot its position over time. So we've got time on the x-axis, position on the y-axis. The plot would look something like this, assuming the car is moving at constant speed. And so to quantify the speed mathematically, what we do is we take the gradient of this line. So we say we take a time step, for example, an hour, and we measure how far does the car move in that time. Let's say 60 miles, and then the speed would be 60 miles per hour. So we just take the change in position divided by the change in time. So one of the nice things about a car moving at constant speed is that it doesn't matter how big this time step is. We can say it moved 60 miles in 1 hour or 120 miles in 2 hours, and we still get 60 miles per hour. But now what if the car isn't moving at constant speed? What if we have a car that is changing speed, something like this? The line is no longer a straight line. So we have an issue now, because if I want to take the speed at a certain time, so let's say I want to calculate the speed at this time, I can take a time step and I can measure how much the position has changed, but I'll get a different answer if I take a different time step. And this is because the speed is changing, so it's getting sort of contaminated by the change in speed. So can anyone tell me, just unmute your mic and answer, do you think a smaller time step or a larger time step is going to give a more accurate measure of the speed at this time point? So consider now, we're thinking theoretically, so don't worry about sample sizes or noise. Do we think we're going to have more contamination or less contamination with a larger or smaller time step? Anyone at all?
Will there be less contamination with a smaller time step?
Yeah, exactly. So because we want to measure the step of the gradient at this exact point, we want to take a smaller time step as possible, because it's going to have less change in time, change in speed within that time step. So the way that we now define the speed mathematically from this graph is we say we're going to take change in time, and we're going to measure the change in position, but we're going to set this change in time to be infinitely small. So we're going to try and make it as small as possible, okay, an infinitely small step. And so we call this dx by dt, the infinitely small change in position with an infinitely small change in time. So this might be a little bit abstract sounding, a little bit complicated sounding. So another way that we can think about it is if we said, if we have a straight line that carries on from this point, so now if we kept the speed at that point and we just said it was moving at constant speed from that point, so we call this the tangent line, dx by dt is the gradient of that line. So that's another way that you can think about it. So let's go back to our original slide, and now let's say instead of speed, we'll call it dx by dt, describes how the position along the track is changing. Now, anyone that knows mathematicians will know that we're lazy, and so we're going to use a shorthand notation called x dot. So x dot means exactly the same as dx by dt. It's just lazy shorthand notation that saves us writing dx by dt every time. So throughout this talk, I'll use the notation x dot. So often x dot will depend on x. So mathematically, we write this x dot equals f of x. This just means x dot is a function of x. So we put in a value of x and we get a value of x dot. We can put in a different value of x and we might get a different value of x dot. So this type of equation, x dot is equal to f of x, is called an ordinary differential equation, or ODE. So that's sort of the mathematical description of how the dynamical system evolves. So let's go back to the car on the track to try and clarify this a little bit. So remember, the position along the track is called x, but now let's plot its speed, the speed of the car versus its position. So at this point on the track, okay, here, the car's going steeply uphill. So it's going to be slow because it's fighting against gravity. So the speed will be reasonably slow. Over here, on the other hand, it's going downhill. So the car might be going really fast. So the speed's going to be much higher. Similarly here, it's sort of going in the middle, so it'll have middle speed, and fast again here. So if I now draw a line of speed versus position, it might look something like this. And so this is all we mean of x dot is equal to f of x. We have a value of x and we get a value of x dot from it. Okay? So throughout this talk, I'm going to use an example dynamical system. X dot is equal to minus kx, where k is greater than 0. So that just means basically we've got a straight line here that goes through 0, 0 and has a gradient of minus k. So how do I understand what the system is going to do if I have this example system? So we'll think about it once again as the speed of a car on the track. If we pick anywhere where x dot is greater than 0, so this line is above the x-axis, so we pick anywhere on the x-axis that is here, it means that x is increasing. X dot being positive means that x is increasing. So that means that the car is driving forwards. But anywhere in this red zone here, we're driving forwards. So I'll put a line pointing right on the x-axis there. Conversely, if we look at anywhere where x dot is less than 0, so now this line is below the x-axis, it means that the car is reversing. X dot is negative, means x is decreasing. So I'll draw a line left on here. So positive when we're above the x-axis, negative when we're below. And finally, there's one point we've missed, which is right here, which is where x dot is equal to 0. So this means x dot isn't changing. It's the speed is 0. Okay, so the x is no longer changing. It means the car is parked. So in dynamical systems theory, we call this x dot equals 0 a steady state. Once we're at a steady state, we never move away from the steady state. Once the car's parked, it's not going to move around. So recalling that x dot is equal to 0 is the definition of a steady state. Can anyone tell me where the steady state of this ODE would be? might want to use a pen and paper, but just someone shout out the answer.
X equals 5?
Exactly, yes. Yeah, exactly. So we say x dot is 0, we take the equation and we replace x dot with 0. So we've got 2x minus 10 is 0, and then we can then solve that for x is equal to 5. So perfect. So now using this graph, we can say exactly what the system will do given that the car starts at a certain location. So the start point of the system is called the initial conditions. So if I start up over here, for example, so if I start where this blue car is, so I'm here on the x-axis, what I can say is x dot is positive and it's quite high. So I'll be driving right quite quickly. And I'll keep driving right, but because x dot is getting smaller, I'll slow down. And eventually I'll slow down and I'll come to a stop here at the steady state. So that's what happens if I start somewhere over here. If I start somewhere over here, well, x dot is now negative, but quite large. So I'll reverse quickly. And again, I'll keep reversing, but I'll slow down until I come to the steady state and I'll stop there. So this system, this example system here, no matter what happens, no matter where we start, we will head towards the steady state and we'll stop. So this lets us classify the steady state a little bit further, because a steady state that is attractive, so if you start near the steady state, you start in the vicinity of the steady state and move towards the steady state, we call this type of steady state a stable steady state. Okay? So conversely, if I now flip the sign of this equation, so I flip the line on the x-axis, so conversely, in this model, if I start over here, you'll see that x dot is positive and quite low. So I'll slowly move away, and then I'll accelerate, and eventually will increase until we hit infinity. Conversely, if I start over here, I will slowly move away, accelerate, and I will decrease until I hit negative infinity. So if I start near this steady state, it's still a steady state because x dot is 0 at this point. If I start near it, now I'm repelled from it. So we call this type of steady state an unstable steady state. So can everyone see me on the picture? Because we can think of the steady states like if we have a pendulum like this with this pen that I'm holding up, okay? Essentially this pendulum has two steady states. It has one here and then one perfectly balanced upright. So if I start off near the one at the bottom and I let go, I will move back to this steady state at the bottom. So this is a stable steady state. Whereas this perfectly balanced one up here, if I move slightly away from it, I will move away from the steady state. So this steady state up here is an unstable steady state. Okay? So those are the two different types of, or two of the different types of steady state. They're not the only types. So far we've looked at a straight line, so a constant function x dot is equal to k of x. What happens now if we have an arbitrary function? Well, we can do exactly the same thing. It really doesn't matter what the function is. So I can say, for example, this function, if I start over here, x dot is positive, so I move right. Here's a steady state, because x dot is 0, it crosses the x-axis. If I start over here, x dot is negative for all of this section, so we move here. So this is an attractive steady state. It's a stable steady state because the arrows point towards it. If I start over here, x dot is positive, I move right. So this is an unstable steady state, and so on. And over here, x dot is positive. Sorry, x dot is positive. So we increase, and here we increase forever, assuming there's not another steady state up here. So we can analyze any function. It doesn't only apply to the straight line, essentially. And we can see we can basically, by plotting this, we can predict what the system will do, given that we start at certain initial conditions. So now let's go back to the same system that we've been talking about all the way through. But this isn't a seminar to teach you how to model cars driving. It's about modeling the brain. So now let's look at the first brain model that we'll talk about, and we'll call it the firing rate model. So we'll ignore the cars, and we will just have this plot. Now, because it's a firing rate model, we're going to model the firing rate of a group of neurons. So let's first of all instead of calling it X, we'll call it R, because it's a rate. It seems a sensible name for a firing rate. So we'll call it R. And now I'm just going to shuffle the equation a little bit, and I'm going to divide by K, and then I'm going to say tau is 1 over K. So it's the exact same thing, just written slightly differently. And that's because the reason we write it this way is tau is the time constant of this neural population, which I'll talk a little bit more about what that means in a minute if you're not familiar with that. So because it's a firing rate, the firing rate goes between 0 and 1. In this example model, the firing rate goes between 0 and 1, where 0 means no neurons are firing, and 1 means all of the neurons in the population are firing. Now, I should say different models from this one will use a firing rate in Hertz, in which case it goes between 0 and the maximum firing rate. But here, in this type of model that we're going to talk about, it goes between 0 and 1. Okay, no neurons firing to all of the neurons firing. So we're only going to look at this section up here. So what we can say is if these equations model a population of neurons that have a firing rate R, then no matter what the initial conditions, no matter if all the neurons or only a small number of neurons are firing, eventually the population will stop firing, it will die out, it will move towards 0 and stop. But what happens now if I add a value S to this equation? Can anyone tell me now, where is the steady state of this system, and is it stable? Anyone at all? So remember, we write R dot is 0 to find the steady state. So if we replace this with 0, can anyone tell me where minus R plus S is 0?
So S equal to the R?
Yes, exactly. So the steady state is when R is equal to S. Exactly. So that's the steady state. And can anyone tell me, so if we look at this, we'll say this is positive, R dot is positive here, so we move right here, and R dot is negative here, so we're moving left. So can anyone tell me, is it stable or unstable? If the arrows point right here. Anyone?
Is it stable?
Yes, it's stable, exactly. Because the arrows are pointing towards the steady state, it means it's stable. We would move towards it. So if I'm over here, if I start off here, firing rates, say 1, R dot is negative, so we'll decrease until R dot is S and then stop. And if R dot is 0, if R is 0, for example, R dot will increase until R is S and then stop. So now what this says is this is a firing rate of a model that will tend to fire naturally at the value S. Okay? So we can now make this S a function of the input to the system. So what this basically means is, given some input to the system, some stimulus, for example, we can measure how much the neurons that we're trying to model will fire, what the overall firing rate of the model is. And we can then make an input-output function that says, given an input, what is the firing rate of the population at that input? And typically in neural populations, we see this looks like a sigmoid. So this is a common function used to describe this. Okay. I should say, actually, this is a little bit of, not a typo, but sort of an inconsistency. This K isn't the same as the K before when we had this. It's a different K. I should just clarify that now. I've only just spotted that, actually. It's a different K. It's just the slope of the sigmoid. But yeah, so essentially what this says, given some stimulus to the population, it will now fire at firing rate S. So to give you an idea of what this means, let's consider a bunch of neurons that are firing. So with no stimulus into the neurons, this black line shows the firing rate, and about 10% of the neurons at any given time are firing. I then put the stimulus up to 1, and about half of the neurons at any time are firing. And then when I cut out the stimulus, it goes back to about 10%. So the sigmoid function, the input-output relationship of this model, of these neurons, looks something like this. So you can see that when the stimulus is 0, the firing rate is 0.1, and when the stimulus is 1, the firing rate is 0.5, and so on. So now, if I go back and I simulate this equation, this is shown in red here, and you can see that we get dynamics that largely match the firing rate of the simulated population. And now the time constant tau, all that does is it tells us how quickly do I go to the steady state. So a very fast time constant means I'll very quickly approach the steady state, and it'll look more like a square input-output, whereas a slow firing rate, a slow time constant means that it will slowly tend towards this and slowly decay back down. So that's all this tau means in this equation. So I will quickly now summarize what we've seen so far. A dynamical system is something that evolves over time. We can describe it using ordinary differential equations. The types of system that we've seen so far that have a single equation, a single variable x, can do one of two things. They can increase or decrease forever. They can go to plus or minus infinity, or they can stop at a steady state. And steady states can be stable or unstable. So at this point, does anyone have any questions for me, or should I move on? Okay. So I'm now going to talk about higher dimensional dynamical systems, because there might have been something that you've heard me say about these one-dimensional systems that you might think is a bit weird, and namely that it was that you either increase or decrease forever, or you come to a steady state. In nature, there are many systems that don't do just those two things. And a key example for people maybe at Kubrick and you know, others that are interested in MEG and EEG, for example, might be brain oscillations, so alpha rhythms, gamma rhythms, so on. These aren't a steady state because it's an oscillation, and it's not increasing or decreasing forever. So to capture oscillations, we need higher dimensional dynamical systems. So what this means is, all the dimensionality means is the number of equations that we use to describe it. So previously we've just had one variable x, and we've had f of x, one equation. In a 2D system, we might have an x and a y. So we need two equations, x dot and y dot, and so on for a 3D system, and 4D and so on. So it's just the number of equations that we need to use to describe the system. So can anyone now can anyone take a guess at where the steady state of this system is at all? So I'll give you a hint. For it to be a steady state, both x dot and y dot have to be equal to 0. One of them equaling 0 isn't sufficient. So you essentially need to solve these two equations. Anyone?
Y equals 2 and x equals to -1.
Yes, exactly. So yeah, from the first equation, we can see that y has to equal 2. And if we then put y equals 2 into this equation, we get 2x plus 2 is 0, which means x is -1. Perfect. So that's the last bit of maths I'm going to ask you to do. I really just wanted to stress that you need both of the equations to equal 0 for it to be a steady state. So we can treat two-dimensional systems in the exact same way as we treated a one-dimensional system. So before, we looked at a location on the x-axis and we said, is x dot positive or negative? And then we drew an arrow pointing left or right, depending on if it was negative or positive. In 2 dimensions, we pick a point in the x and y plane. So it's not just the x-axis now, it's the 2-dimensional plane. But we pick a point and we say, is x dot positive? And if so, it's pointing to the right. And is y dot positive? And if so, it's pointed upwards. And so now we can do an arrow saying what direction are we pointing. And we can do that for lots of different locations on this axis, on this plane, sorry. And then essentially we can start at an initial condition over here, and we can follow the arrows around, okay? And we will see a path as we follow the arrows around. And that shows us how the system evolves. And this particular system will loop back around onto this red sort of circle here. And once it hits this circle, it will carry on going round and round and round forever. So now we have an oscillation. In mathematical terms, in dynamical systems, we call this a periodic orbit, but informally it's an oscillation. And much like a steady state, once we're on the oscillation, we don't move off the oscillation. And much like a steady state, an oscillation can be stable or unstable. So you can see here, this is a stable oscillation. So they started at lots of different locations in this XY plane, and it always moves onto the oscillation. The lines always go onto the oscillation, so it's stable. An unstable one, you'd move away from the oscillations. So now, if we look in 3 dimensions, well, E is effectively 2 dimensions because they said Z can't change, and it shows that you can have oscillations. If we allow Z to change, you can get some interesting phenomena such as bursting. So this can be bursting of neurons, or it can be, for example, fast and slow oscillations in neural masses. And we can also get some really interesting stuff called chaos, which I'm not going to go into here, but if you've seen the butterfly effect, you'll know that what this means is a small change will completely change the outcome. So it's very unpredictable. So some bursts will have 3 spikes, some will have 5, some will have 4, and so on. It's a very unpredictable system. So you can have lots and lots of really interesting dynamics in as few as 3 equations. But we only need 2 to model oscillations. And so now I'm going to talk to you about something called the Wilson-Cowan model. So the Wilson-Cowan model is a 2-dimensional version, 2-equation version of the firing rate model that I talked about earlier. And because it's 2 dimensions, it means that we can have oscillations. So now you can model alpha or gamma rhythms and so on. So this is just the equations that I showed you earlier. This is just the slide I showed you earlier. And now we're going to adapt it to 2 equations. So first of all, what we've got is we've got 2 populations now. We've got an excitatory population and an inhibitory population. So instead of calling them R, we'll call it E and I, just to differentiate between the 2. So if I go back to the previous slide, we had tau R dot is minus R plus S of input. Now we've got 2 equations, tau E, the excitatory time constant, E dot is minus E, SE, the excitatory sigmoid of the input, and the same for I. So these 2 equations are just the firing rate equations, but for each population, okay? So we've just repeated it twice. So what is the input to E and the input to I in this system here? Okay, so first of all, we typically have a stimulus going into the excitatory population, as we had before. So we'll call this stimulus P. It could be a constant, it could be something to evoke a potential, but we have it going into the system, so we'll call this P. So that's one of the inputs to the excitatory population. Furthermore, we've got excitatory to excitatory synapses. So we have this value CEE. This is sort of a lumped constant that says the density of synapses and the strength of excitatory connections, so the strength of AMPA, for example, or NMDA. And this obviously, so this tells us the strength of the connections. And so the input to the system is going to also depend on E, which is the presynaptic firing rate, so the number of presynaptic potentials. So what we have now is CEE, the connectivity from E to E, and the firing rate of the E population. So that is also an input to the excitatory population. Now finally, the inhibitory population also inputs to the excitatory population. And this is inhibitory, so we're going to make it minus, but it's the same idea. It's the strength of the inhibitory to excitatory connections times by the number of presynaptic firing, you know, the inhibitory firing rate. So now this is the Wilson-Cowan equation for the excitatory system. Similarly, we can describe the inhibitory system. So typically, we don't put an input to the inhibitory system, a constant input, a stimulus to the inhibitory system. But there's no reason you can't if you want to. You can absolutely just put a Q here, for example. But typically, we just have the recurrent connection, so that CEI and CII, okay? So this is the Wilson-Cowan model. It was developed in the 70s and is a really nice two-dimensional, so reasonably simple, reasonably quick to simulate model of cortical oscillations. And even though it was developed in the 70s and one of the first models, it still remains popular to this day. And you can see here, this is a 2011 paper that has used the model exactly how we've described it to study functional connectivity by including the structural connectivity and inputting from different locations. So they've got this additional input now. So it would just be another term over here into the excitatory population from all the different locations. So it's still a really nice example of a very simple model that can describe the oscillatory dynamics or the evoked dynamics of the brain. So now I'm going to set everyone onto a practical session, and you're going to learn how to simulate these dynamics on a computer. So to do so, you'll use a method called the Euler Method. So you might remember right at the very start, we said the slope, the gradient, is if we take an infinitely small time step. Now, computers can't take an infinitely small time step, but what they can do is they can take lots and lots of very, very small time steps. So the Euler method, it says, given an initial condition, so time I and xi, okay, it says if I want to predict the next time point, okay, so I want to predict what the system will be at in a time ti plus h, we take a small time step. It essentially says we calculate the gradient at the initial condition, we calculate f of x, so we calculate x dot, and we assume that this is a constant slope up to between those 2 points. And then it calculates, based on this constant slope, what the next value of x would be. So then to simulate over a long time period, you then start at the next point and calculate the slope and so on. And you just iteratively calculate the next point. Okay? So I'm not going to talk through this next slide in detail, but essentially you can go to this GitHub repository and download the slides and the MATLAB practical, and you can work through worksheet number 1. There are the solutions in there. So there's in this folder, there is a PDF file called solutions.pdf. This will give you a bit more further background, so it's worth just reading through that as well once you've answered it and check your results are in line. I'm going to stay online on this Zoom meeting for another hour, so until 3 p.m. So you can ask questions about that then here on Zoom, or you can log into the forum and ask on there. And so we plan on checking the forums until the 11th. After that, let us know that you've posted on there because we won't check regularly. You can also check the syntax guide if your issues are mostly with MATLAB implementation, because we can't really be there to help with MATLAB. I've put in a syntax guide which basically gives you the step-by-steps required for each task. So everything from just opening up MATLAB, writing a script, and so on. And again, you can ask these solutions. So I'm going to leave this open now. And if you have any questions, please ask away on Zoom. I'll be around for an hour. And also we'll have breakout rooms with some of the other tutors, so you can ask them questions sort of in private as well. So just say, can I head on to a breakout room? Great, thank you. Are there any more questions?
Thank you, Luke. I think we should give you some applause, really.
Yeah.
Yes, Luke. Thank you a lot.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. Really good.
Thanks
Thanks.
so much.
Very good.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Right.